In this third video, we'll continue our discussion of bootstrapping yield curve, but in this video, we're going to specifically look at two yields: the nominal yield and the inflation index yield. The nominal yield is just a regular treasury. For a 10-year treasury, you get 2.61%, and you get that guaranteed for 10 years. And then the TIPS has a stated yield of 0.37%. So if you bought the yield today, you would get 0.37%, and then each year the Treasury will add whatever inflation is, the consumer price index, CPI, will be added to the principal of your debt every year. So you'll make 0.37% plus inflation. Well, the nice thing about the Treasury introducing inflation-linked bonds is that we now have a very direct way to determine what the bond market thinks inflation will be in the future, because the only difference in these two bonds, the nominal and the TIP, is inflation. Now, some people say, well, we can say what the bond market thinks inflation will be the next 10 years by just taking the 10-year nominal and subtracting the 10-year TIP, and that's 2.24%. Or we take the 5-year nominal and subtract the 5-year TIP, and that's 1.91%. You'll notice that the stated yield on the 5-year TIP is actually a negative number, which means if you buy a TIP today for 5 years, you're actually locking in something that will underperform inflation, a negative real yield. Now, this approach is fine. You can do that, just subtract. But the problem with doing that is that we know that inflation is very seasonal and very sensitive to near-term events. So when you look at just subtracting these two, there's a lot of noise in an inflation number in the near term. So the most common approach, in fact, I picked up this approach from an economist who works a lot with the Federal Reserve, and his argument is that this approach that he uses is the approach that Ben Bernanke uses to watch what the market thinks inflation is. And it's what it's called, it's the 5-year forward break-even inflation rate. And so what we're going to actually do is essentially what we did in video number 1 is we're going to calculate the 5-year forward rate for the 5-year treasury. What does the bond market say they believe the 5-year treasury rate will be in 5 years? And then we'll do the exact same thing for the TIP, and then we'll compare those two. And by doing that, by looking out 5 years and comparing two 5-year treasury rates in 5 years, those two forward rates, we get rid of that noise that's in the inflation assumptions today. We'll still use the same formula, 1 plus the long spot rate raised to the 10th power. So we use the 10-year treasury, 1 plus the 10-year rate raised to the 10th, divided by 1 plus the 5-year rate raised to the 5th. So take that fraction, and we'll raise it to the 1/5 power minus 1. All we've got to do, though, is do that for both the nominal and for the TIPS. So for the nominal, if you remember the math here, equal open parentheses 3 times 1 plus the 10-year rate, close parentheses, raised to the 10th, close parentheses, divided by open parentheses twice 1 plus the 5-year rate, close parentheses, raised to the 5th, close parentheses, and that whole thing raised to the 1 divided by 5 minus 1. If you remember, that was 3.84% before. So we're going to do that exact same thing now, but for the TIP. And so for the TIP, I copied it down so it works. But for the TIP, I'll go ahead and do the entire equation. Equal, open parentheses 3 times 1 plus the 10-year TIP, close parentheses, raised to the 10th, close parentheses, divided by open parentheses twice 1 plus the 5-year TIP, raised to the 5th, close parentheses twice, and raise all of that to the 1 divided by 5 minus 1. And that tells us what the nominal 5-year forward rate, the TIP, inflation-linked 5-year forward rate, and now the break-even inflation is simply the difference in those two. 384 minus 127. If you compare that, if I just taken the 10-year and subtracted, I got 224, a much lower number. And if I just done that with the 5-year, I would have gotten 1.91%. So you can see we do get a substantially different number. What I would strongly recommend that you do is go to the Federal Reserve site, which is pretty easy to do. You just in Google type H15. So if you search on H15, it will give you the St. Louis Fed site. Will also bring up a lot of history, and all you need to do is bring in the history of the 10-year Treasury, the 5-year Treasury, the 10-year tips. Will not go back much beyond 2003 because this bond has not been around that long, but you have 10 years worth of data. So the 10-year tip, the 5-year tip. Do this equation historically and watch how the break-even inflation number moves over time. What I got from this economist that works a lot with the Fed is he argues that if this break-even inflation gets above 3%, the Federal Reserve will then be very concerned that the market is starting to be thinking about inflation. And once that gets into the psyche of the market, it's very difficult to take that out of the thought process. And so that once the break-even inflation gets above 3%, the Federal Reserve will probably be forced to raise short-term rates in order to try to slow inflation down. So if you look at this number over time, it's a very good gauge of what the bond market thinks about inflation. It's a gauge that supposedly the Federal Reserve watches very, very carefully. And also, this can be a very good way to forecast inflation. If your boss asks you to give an inflation forecast, so this break-even 5-year forward inflation rate is a very good approach. Now, this economist I spoke to, he did say that he believes there is a risk premium in this number. That is, the nominal Treasury is has a lot of risk related to inflation, whereas the TIPS is protected from inflation. So this 2.58% is not just what the market thinks about inflation, but it also includes a risk premium. What is that risk premium? Well, that's the difficult part. That's theoretical. He believes it's, last time I read his papers, he believed it's about 0.25%. So your true market view of inflation would be the break-even inflation minus the risk premium, whatever risk premium you decide to go with. So he would show a market forecast for inflation about 2.33%. Remember that the Federal Reserve says they're targeting inflation around 2 to 2.5%. So that has helped keep the inflation forecast or the view of the bond market of inflation around that level. So I hope these videos have helped, but they will not help unless you yourself go back and calculate these, go back historically, build different charts to compare these rates over time, try to build forward curves, try to do historical break-even inflation, do whatever you can to get practice with bootstrapping the yield curve because it's a very powerful tool.